Even a drying dragon still warms the land with its last fire, and the foolish kingdom is the one that lets the flame vanish before the cold has learned to spare it. So our case coming from closing government is not every declining industry must be preserved forever, but we push that no responsible state should allow the entire parts of its economy to collapse all at once when it still has the capacity to manage that decline more safely and more gradually. On opposition, their transition story is contingent on luck, just like what Joseph has stated with his POI, because they never explain why firms in declining industry would somehow survive long enough to reinvent themselves without first being wiped out by the market. It is also contingent on government bailout, because once those firms become too weak to protect their jobs or restructure on their own, the only fallback is for the state to step in and after the damage is already done. So by our contrast, in our comparative, our side is more plausible because the market leaders that still have enough scale to engage in mergers and acquisitions that can still consolidate early and preserve the strongest part of its industry before the collapse totally happens, still have the capacity to do so. CO is also out of this debate because they're saying that it's going to be a harmful precedent. Bro, it's not like every part of the industry or every people in this industry wants their industry to survive and manipulate that to happen. Their own entire income margin will be fought, and also investors will be super gun in their side. Nobody wants this to happen, and we want to solve this problem while we can, because the language of op is to do not bring any substance of solution at all, because they're saying that fuck, it's their own fault, let them get wrecked and let's just bail them out afterwards. Problem, this also harms your own constituent, your own economy when these industries die further. Common sense, you stop debating unrealistically. And yes, we want this to be a precedent for a precedent or practice for the state mechanism, because we allow dying industries even in the future to prevent larger fracture for your own economy as a state. Few clarification before we start. Sure, I'll take the POI.
So in your world, are you comfortable slowing down the growth of these more efficient industries in order to keep these less competitive industries alive? You're trading.
Listen to your logical fallacy. That's not a real dichotomy. Like, bro, you're not slowing down innovation in the other side of the margin when that margin is already thriving. That's the reason why these industries are dying. Like, for example, you have digital media who will always thrive no matter what, even if you have this specific policy, simply because they are thriving. That's the reason why traditional newspaper industry are dying. Blah blah blah. You guys are really out of the comparative. Stop debating in a bin room level. So first, this debate is not about industries facing random short-term shocks like temporary gas price hikes or isolated cost spikes, because those pressures can almost happen at any sector, including the ones in developing countries, without meaning the industry itself is structurally collapsing. That's why top half is weird, because they want to co-opt larger means of scope, but to the expense of running a false matter, which can never happen in real life. What this debate is actually about is about industries that are being outpaced by the logic of the current market itself, where the competition no longer pushes them to improve, but instead accelerates their disappearance, like how traditional newspaper have been steadily displaced by digital media. Problem, they cannot simply transition in the way that opposition imagines, because often requires dismantling the very business that they are currently in. A print media company, for example, cannot fully shift into a digital platform without collapsing their entire revenue model, entire labor structure, entire infrastructure, and institutional identity that kept the regional company alive in the first place. They need to create a new company in order for that to happen. Problem, you still don't prove why they will, one, have the capital to do so, and two, have the means to do so. Because again, at no point in this debate do you prove why those transitions are much more going to happen. You don't have any likelihood analysis. So it is often self-liquidated dress up as a transition in our side. More importantly, at no point in this debate did opposition explain why these firms would realistically have the capital, time, or market position to survive that destruction that is happening right now, then successfully reemerge in an entirely new industry. So in your side, you have a lot of people that are laid off. You have a lot of industries that harms the economies of your states that's going to happen. So that means you guys don't have any solvency because you guys are super stuck in the debate land. We say that this industry still matters because they still hold jobs, infrastructure, skills, and any other type of social functions that are not easy to replace overnight. So the point that we have is we need to keep them long enough to survive, to transition, preserve what remains valuable, and retain the possibility of future recovery rather than letting the market wipe them out completely without doing anything at all. Because this clears out the scope of the legible material within this debate and also proves that ops material only happens or why ops impact only happens better in our side. First issue then, is the sustenance of this industry vital or harmful? Op said that this doesn't prove any productive means because, you cannot produce any means of solution at all. But just like what Joseph stated out, antitrust relaxation solves the problem by letting this firm stop behaving like isolated competitors in a market that no longer has enough demand to sustain them all. Like, look at your notes, and if you look at it, you will see that you will realize that Op wants them to keep this land of competition with no means of alleviating the problem that they have. All of the case that they have are wrangling the debate with no solvency. That's why we say that as long as antitrust remains strict, each company is forced to keep chasing the market share through lower prices. That's why you have duplicated spending and you have short-term survival tactics, which drains the entire industry faster. This is the reason why they're facing this quote-unquote significant decline. So I don't really get the logical stance of op teams here. Well, of course, your fucking call-outs will work if this is an ordinary industry. But Chair, look at the nuance. This is the dying industry. You live this smaller company scatter. You will face layoff. You will face supplier bankruptcies and political resentment. Here's the mech on why this is going to be successful. How does consolidation solve the problem? We say that once this is allowed, firms can reduce excess capacity, combine resources, and plan closures or restructuring in a way that preserves the strongest part of that sector instead of letting everyone weaken their stance. So even if they say that, this will result to a lot of layoff, blah, blah, blah. And we say that at least you preserve some part of the industry that doesn't fracture your economy in a way that happens in a larger extent. You don't do it in 100%. Of course, they're going to save some money. They're going to save some industry and close some factories. The difference is that those workers within these factories will suddenly have enough sustainable wages, will suddenly have a surviving entity that is actually large enough to preserve at least the meaningful portion of the job that they have until they transition. Another level of meta then, once that happens, they can shut down the weakest branches, move remaining demand into the strongest operation, and use money that they have instead of wasting duplication. Because again, this companies wants to survive. This industries wants to retain what they have. Of course, other industries are thriving. That's why they want to still retain their worker. It's not like they're going to fuck up their own worker just because they have a lot of autonomy. At least in our side, we say that they have larger incentive, but not just an incentive. We give them the capacity to protect their own workers and sustain their industry until they transition. You don't get that macro principle inside opposition insofar as one, state is so negligible in their side, and two, it is only in our side where the state is not merely an observer of the failure market, because once that entire industry collapses in a fragmented way, the harm does not stay inside private firms, but spread out in a lot of the bases of your own economy.